Ladies and gentlemen, our keynote speaker, Professor the Honorable Gareth Evans, used to be the adopted brother of Prime Minister Hun Sen and of Prince Ranariddh when they were in government, but because he has always acted on the interests of the Cambodian people, he lost his adoption papers, and he's no longer the adopted brother of Prince Ranariddh or of Prime Minister Hun Sen. He's currently the Chancellor of the Australian National University, as well as being involved in many United Nations advisory bodies. He has also served recently as President of the International Crisis Group based in Brussels. I used to be the fly in the room when he used to meet with King Sihanouk. I was the note taker. And I always admire the energy Gareth had of convincing people to move forward to the next step of the plan that he had developed for peace in Cambodia. So I thought that we could take some of that energy today and bring him here to share it with us. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much, Julio, and it's a great pleasure and a privilege to be with you here today. Let me apologise at the outset for keeping you waiting. I'm afraid I had to fly in from Adelaide this morning and planes were late and I got delayed, but here I am and it's hugely pleasurable to be with you. Let me say at the outset that the sad passing of King Father Norodom Sihanouk last month brought back for me a flood of memories about people, places, and a country which really has been engraved on my heart since I first travelled there as a young student, some 45 years ago now, in 1968. And many of those memories are about His Majesty personally, who I first met in 1989, then many times subsequently in the course of the Cambodian peace process. His hospitality was always extraordinarily gracious. Whatever the time, as Julio will well remember, it was always champagne time. And his personal style, while sometimes a little bit quirky and a little bit quicksilverish, was really, I found, always very endearing and very engaging. Well, it's not, I think, entirely unfair to say that in the course of his very long and complicated history as king, overthrown king, reinstated king, then abdicated king, he sometimes made the wrong calls, was sometimes, just occasionally, a little bit more part of the problem than part of the solution. But he did have a deep and abiding love of his country. He was passionately determined to maintain its independence. His love for his country was, I think, more than reciprocated by his people. And he was very much part of the solution at some crucial stages, and I'll mention a couple of my remarks a little later on. So I thought it might be useful, particularly for those new generation scholars who I understand are here at this seminar and who didn't actually live and breathe through these events, for me to describe to you in a little bit of detail the peace process in which I and others were engaged in the late 1980s and the early 1990s. I do apologise for any of you who've heard all this from me before, but I hope it'll be interesting for the others of you. And I do this partly because it's a rather good example of cooperative Australian engagement with the region, 20 years or more before the current flurry of interest in white papers and Australia in the Asian century. I do it partly because of its intrinsic interest. This story was one of the most complex peace settlements that was ever successfully conducted. And I do it also partly because so many of the stresses and fault lines of present-day Cambodia do have echoes in the divisions of that time, and I'll conclude by saying something about present-day Cambodia. But nobody should forget the extent to which Cambodia was on its knees by the late 1980s. Since 1970, the The country had been ravaged successively by massive US bombing, by civil war, by a genocidal reign of terror exceeded only by the Nazis, by invasion and by civil war again, resulting overall in the deaths of some 2 million Cambodians and the destruction in other ways of the lives and the life opportunities of many more. The Vietnamese invasion in November 1978 brought to an end the worst of the Khmer Rouge reign of terror, but of course it triggered a new civil war. Recurring bloody military engagements, guerrilla assaults and ambushes, the further displacement of large numbers of civilians, and the inability of life generally to return to any kind of pre-1970 normality all took their toll of an exhausted, long-suffering people. Nor should anyone forget how complex and intractable the continuing conflict was, being played out, as it was, at 3 distinct levels. The first level was that of the warring internal factions, with Hun Sen's government waged against a fragile coalition of the non-communist Sihanoutists and KPNLF, Son San's group, on the one hand, and the communist Khmer Rouge on the other, and each group was immensely distrustful of all the others. The second level was the regional one, with Vietnam, of course, supporting Hun Sen, ASEAN supporting Hun Sen's opponents. And the third level, overlapping all of this, involved the great power patrons of the warring factions, with China supporting the Khmer Rouge and Prince Sihanouk, as he then was, the Soviet Union supporting Hun Sen, and the United States supporting the two non-communist resistance groups. To unravel all this and to produce out of it something resembling a durable peace, even if, as I'll come back to later, we haven't quite yet seen a durable human rights respecting democracy in Cambodia, but to produce a durable peace really was a pretty formidable achievement for the international community. Australia's involvement in this achievement dates back to 1983, when the Hawke government came to office with a commitment to play a more active role in the Cambodian settlement. And from the outset, the Labor government's Indochina policy, as it was then described under Foreign Minister Bill Hayden, for that first 5 years from 83 to 88, focused on exploring the various options for a Cambodian settlement. In the later 1980s, other regional countries, and in particular Indonesia, gradually sought themselves to play a more active diplomatic role in pursuit of a solution to the problem. And the resulting Jakarta informal meetings, as they came to be known, in July 1988 and February 89, took place but were inconclusive. Although they did result in some clearer definition of the issues involved, there was no significant lessening of the differences among the 4 Cambodian factions. But hopes for a major move forward had risen with the announcement by Vietnam in January 1989 that it was actually prepared to withdraw all its troops from Cambodia by September that year. And taking advantage of that, seeking to force a breakthrough, France, the former colonial power and still a significant influence then in the region, France judged that by mid-89 the time was ripe for a full international conference on Cambodia. So what was called the Paris Conference on Cambodia, or PIC, Paris International Conference, was accordingly convened with joint Indonesian-French chairmanship in Paris in July-August 89. And this brought together the 4 Cambodian factions, 6 then ASEAN countries, the permanent 5 members of the UN Security Council, plus Vietnam and Laos and Australia and Canada and India, as well as rather implausibly Zimbabwe, because it was then representing the non-aligned movement. There was also a representative of the UN Secretary General. In the event, although there were huge expectations created, the 1989 Paris Conference failed, but not without coming quite close to succeeding. A comprehensive settlement strategy was mapped out, which broke down however, broke down for a number of reasons, but really only one reason was crucial. And this was because one side of the conflict, as we've described them, the combined resistance forces of Sihanouk, Sun San and the Khmer Rouge, together with their different international backers, demanded a place for each of the four factions in a transitional administration, including a place for the Khmer Rouge. But the demand that the Khmer Rouge be represented around that table was something that the SOC, the State of Cambodia government of Hun Sen, and its international backers was simply not prepared to concede. So this was the context in which Australia then came into the picture in a very major way. This was the context of the Australian peace proposal, which I announced in outline in the Australian Senate on the 24th of November 1989. So as to sidestep this power-sharing issue, this place at the table issue, which had bedeviled the Paris conference, and so as to constrain the role of the Khmer Rouge in the transitional administration, in the transitional arrangements, we proposed something new, that the United Nations be directly involved in the civil administration of Cambodia during the transitional period. There should be, we said, a UN military presence to monitor the ceasefire, cessation of external military assistance. There should be a UN role in organising and conducting elections, and there should be UN involvement, direct involvement, in the transitional administrative arrangements to ensure that a neutral political environment arose which was conducive to fair and free elections. At the heart of the idea of giving this then unprecedentedly central role to the UN, not just in the familiar roles of peacekeeping or electoral monitoring, but in the actual governance of the country during the transitional period, the heart of the idea was that this would give China a face-saving way of withdrawing its support from the Khmer Rouge, which we hoped would then, the Khmer Rouge, wither on the vine without that Chinese support. And it was essentially this solution, with this rationale, with this key central theme, although there was a very long diplomatic road ahead with many twists and turns, some of which I'll take you through, which did unlock the conflict and which did bring about the long-awaited and desperately needed peace to the country. Now, the idea of a major United Nations involvement in a transitional administration was not itself completely new. As Julia will well know, and others here like David Chancellor having documented and written the history of all of this, Prince Sihanouk had himself, for example, as early as 1981 and occasionally subsequently raised the idea of some form of United Nations trusteeship. It was US Congressman, a very influential US Congressman called Stephen Solars, who thought that the idea of some kind of direct UN involvement as a trustee or maybe something else was a good one that needed resurrection. And he floated that in 1989 around the various corridors in Washington, but found no one that was remotely interested in taking him seriously. Then as now, any mention of the UN around Washington does not tend to get people very enthusiastic, and people thought that this was just another flaky idea. But it was Solars who persuaded me in a meeting that I had with him in the lounge room of the Australian permanent rep to the UN in the latter part of '89. It was him that persuaded me that this was an idea really worth pursuing. I've told the story a few times, and I'll tell it again. I happened to have sitting with me a very senior Australian diplomat who shall remain nameless. It wasn't the ambassador to the UN, listening into this conversation. And he sat there just very quietly while I was going backwards and forwards with Solars. And when it was all over, walking